Okay, umoya ulight, umoya bright. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We at Moya Podcast are teaming up with the University of Limpopo to, I don't know if we're celebrating the 70 years of the Freedom Charter, but we are definitely going to unpack it for you guys, the youth who's not familiar with what is the Freedom Charter, how did we get here with our Constitution. You're going to learn that tonight. As usual, our teacher, South African history teacher, on the panel this evening, we're going to have Upra Steve Livello, Notatumanda Sloane, to unpack this contentious issue and to give us our history and to perhaps steer a direction forward. We also acknowledge the people who are the students that are with us in the audience. Molweni, and thank you for joining. And hopefully you guys have got questions too. To the audience watching online, you know that you can comment on the side and in the comment section, and your questions will stream on screen so that you can be part of the conversation. Once again, thank you so much for joining this session. Ndate Steve, 70 years. Please take us exactly where you want us to go. We are here. We are your people. Unmute your mic, Ndate Steve.
Hi, Nziki. And good evening, everybody. Ramanda, I was hoping that you were going to start, but Nziki, let's get down to it. Yes, this is the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the Freedom Charter. And already there has been a lot of discussions and discourses going on around it. But I think there's one thing that
my goodness, Steve, can I just disturb you there? That Steve, I'm so sorry. I see that yes. I actually got the order wrong. I got the order wrong. And sorry, can we start again? Because I do see that everybody who is here actually was meant to go. My sincere apologies. Can we start with Dr. Todzi Mahunele, who's the head of Department of the Social Science and Economic Management Education at University of Limpopo? Apologies. I just got the program now. Dr. Todzi, good evening. Kolo, please, protocol observed.
I know, that's getting me off the hook. That's getting me off the
hook. Good evening. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Let me start off by just greeting everyone. Program Director Nziki. I notice we have veterans today. I want to say to them, good evening. Colleagues, honored guests, students, if there are political leaders in our midst, to you all, I say good evening. It is for me both an honor and a profound responsibility to welcome you to tonight's Freedom Charter Dialogue. On this day, the 26th of June, which marks, as Nziki has already said, exactly 70 years since the people of South Africa declared with one voice that the people shall govern. For me, this is no ordinary commemoration. It is not simply about the memories. It is about meaning. And tonight, I want to welcome you, but also invite you not just to remember the Freedom Charter, but to interrogate it, as Ndate Steve had already started. I want to challenge you, colleagues and students, into asking ourselves some questions, critical questions, such as, has the Freedom Charter been fulfilled or betrayed? Are the freedoms it declared now tangible for all or only for some? What happens to a vision when it becomes part of state policy? Does it remain a people's vision, or does it risk becoming a hollow slogan? The charter begins with words that still echo across generations. And I'm just going to quote, "We, the people of South Africa, declare for all our country and the world to know," close quote. But my question to you and the rest of the panel is, who are the people now? Are we still united by a common dream? Or are we divided by inequality, exclusion, and historical amnesia? The charter proclaimed that the land shall be shared among those who work it. Yet today, hunger for land persists. The Freedom Charter envisioned a South Africa where land, the cornerstone of dignity and economic independence, would be restored to the dispossessed. This was not only about restitution. For me, and probably a few more others, it was about justice, self-reliance, and erasing the deep scars of colonialism and apartheid. Yet in 2025, the structure of land ownership remains largely unchanged. A small elite, often removed from the land itself, controls vast tracts, while millions of Black South Africans remain landless. Tenant farmers, backyard dwellers, or even squished into overcrowded urban settlements. The pace of land reform has been painfully slow, hamstrung by bureaucracy, elite capture, and an overcautious legal framework. Even where land has been redistributed, support for productive use has been minimal, making the promise ring hollow. Land hunger today is not just physical, it is spiritual and generational. It represents not only the absence of hectares, but the denial of agency, identity, and legacy. The Freedom Charter declared that there shall be houses, security, and comfort. Yet for millions, the promise of dignity is still deferred and far from being a reality. The Charter recognized housing not just as shelter, but as a site of human dignity, a place to feel safe, to build a family, to dream. Today, although millions of RDP houses have been delivered, too many are poorly built, poorly located, and disconnected from opportunities, services, and dignity. Informal settlements continue to grow, not as a temporary solution, but as permanent conditions of life. People live with no proper sanitation, no electricity, and no security. A reality far removed from the vision of comfort that was promised by the Charter. And increasingly, housing has become a commodity, not a right, a space of speculation rather than belonging. Is this the kind of dream the Charter promised? That's one of my questions. Before I close, the Charter dreamed of a South Africa where the doors of learning and culture shall be opened. And yet the schooling of the poor is still too often a betrayal of that promise. This was a revolutionary claim that every child, regardless of class or color, would have access to education that liberates. But today, our schools still reflect apartheid-era geographies and inequalities. Public schools in rural and township areas are often overcrowded, under-resourced, and neglected. Children walk long distances, learn in crumbling classrooms, or even attend schools with pit toilets. Meanwhile, private and former Model C schools flourish with digital resources, enriched curricula, and international opportunities. Are the doors really opened? Perhaps in theory, but in practice, they remain closed to the majority. And literally, several rural village schools have been closed down as I'm speaking today. And culture, especially African languages, histories, and worldviews, is still treated as an optional extra rather than a foundation of identity and self-worth. Ladies and gentlemen, to betray education is to betray the future. So I welcome you to this dialogue, not of nostalgia, but of reckoning. Not just a dialogue of celebration, but of challenge. Let us reread the Freedom Charter not as a sacred text, but as a living document. Let us not just salute its vision, but ask further questions. What must we do now in our time to make it real? Because if the Freedom Charter was, in 1955, a roadmap for liberation, then in 2025, it must become a mirror reflecting how far we have traveled and how far we still must go. Let us think critically, speak honestly, and act boldly. Of course, the people shall govern, but only if the people are awake. I welcome you to this vital and necessary conversation. Thank you so much. You are muted. Nzigi, you are muted. Nzigi, you are muted.
I don't know what's going on with my technicals today. I'm so sorry, everyone. I was saying that thank you, Dr. Todzi. We appreciate the warm welcome. And I wanted to remind the audience that this program is brought to us by the University of Limpopo. We are unpacking 70 years of the Freedom Charter. So thank you to the University of Limpopo for sharing their time and wisdom with us. Next, we're going to have an overview of the Freedom Charter. We've got Umamfezeka Twaibeni, who's a lecturer at the Department of Social Science and Economic Management Education at the University of Limpopo. My leader, good evening.
Thank you, sis. Thank you, sis. Molweni, good evening. Mine might be very straightforward, but the way I feel overwhelmed. But the overview of the conference hosted by the university and specifically the Department of Cultural and Political Studies in partnership with the Department of Social Sciences Education is partly offering a solution where we can have a space where young academics, specifically the Black ones, can begin to engage as Dr. Todza is inviting us to engage. Now you can imagine, as a generation, we've long celebrated the Freedom Charter, and these days, or now it's 70 years, and the theme or the running themes of this conference is the Freedom Charter in itself, to remember it, to question it, to ponder it, to sit with it. But I think most importantly, by linking the state of emergency, which was declared in 1985, it allows for us to go back and see how far we have came and how difficult it was to have the now democracy, which as South Africa, we didn't choose independence, but we opted for democracy. That in itself is a problem that we continuously as a generation question. Now, one may wonder, Ukuthi, why would we say we just want to create a call that it seems plain? But for young people, for the longest time, we have learned from other generations that there has been a mistake of, what do they say? They say you throw the baby away with the water, almost as if assuming that the Freedom Charter in itself is not important or is not as important as it was back in the time when it was incepted. And we provide themes in this conference that allow for anyone who wants to join in and contribute, whether they are coming in with historical insights where they would talk about the drafting and impact of e-Freedom Charter. Now, I don't know, Sister, if you would know this information, but most of the time when the Freedom Charter is spoken about, it's a mystery, it's an elusive, it's the untouchable. It's almost as if we don't know who actually sat down and wrote it, how things were combined. Now, in my belief and most of my colleagues' belief, we believe that history is not just a past, but it is a place that we go to get concepts that we can use today so that we can begin the orientation of the future. Now, as a mother myself, I'm fully aware of how important it is that I don't conscrew the importance of the Freedom Charter. Flawed as it may be, it was one of the leading and most important documents of its time. And I'm sure Utatu Lebelo would tell us a different story in his oral history, because as a younger generation, we tend to use what we call presentism, where we use the comfort of today to analyze a situation we did not live in. And I find it to be very dangerous and a finicky place to be in, because even today, we do believe that for us to fully realize decolonization, which is one of the themes of our conference, we need to understand why we are here and how we got here and why it is important that we don't repeat what has happened in the past. And the Freedom Charter is so oversimplified into these 10 principles. But those 10 principles, just like this call, are far more complex. Because if you ask a young woman today who says the country should be governed by the people, she will ask you, Guti, are the people the men who I fear that are supposed to govern with me? And where do I belong in terms of this governance? Am I passive in the governance of the country? And if you ask a young Black man today, they will tell you clearly, Guti, I don't know whose government we are talking about, because whenever I have to meet the government, I must go to the road and lament in fighting and be violent as portrayed by the apartheid government. These things are still problematic, because ideally by now we should have redefined ourselves. But I will appreciate this. The call allows for us to start engaging younger academics, novice, and people who have been around academia long enough. And Limpopo is a historically Black institution, and it's important that we notice this, that universities are ecosystems of creating new knowledge. And Black universities in particular, they carry the wounds of most Black students. And you'll notice we strike every year in these institutions to remind ourselves that education is still not free. And the fees must fall has allowed for us to also remember that we still have a voice and we still can do it. And I stand here to confirm, Oguti, on the 16th of July, we will be hosting the conference and people are invited to come. And of course, we have our honorable guest here with us, Utatu Mandla, which would be an honor for me to hear how much of the work he has done. And he'll be our speaker for the day, and come through and pass by and see what we actually do as young people. And, this part of a state of emergency, I am reminded of United Democratic Front when it proposed that we actually need a people's war. Similar to today, we need a people's war. Whatever shape or form, the people's war must still continue, because clearly we haven't made the necessary connections to go back and question what worked then that could work now. When Utatu Nelson Mandela had said, if they do the same or they do as was done by our oppressor, we should remove them. He wasn't romanticizing a struggle. He was probably proposing that a lot still needs to be done. Now, for someone who's born in the 90s and born in the 2000s, the groove might be the place to go, but I think that energy must be directed elsewhere. And through this call, and we would like to thank the research office, which supports our students to come through. And this and you, Mami, for hosting us, because this is also a build-up to the momentum of the actual day. And I know academia is particularly intimidating for younger academics, and that's why, and I'll give an applause to the organizers of the conference. They have allowed for our students to at least be mentored in how to write abstracts. It's a long road to wherever the destination is, and maybe the picture we have of the destination is not as clear as we would hope it would be. But all I'm lamenting today is that the call is there, the day is set, anyone can come, join us if you can, and allow for us not to just celebrate, as Dr. Totse has said, but allow for us to have those necessary questions and probably propose solutions as well. And let's go back to creating, because Abotatu Sobukwe, when they were criticizing the Freedom Charter, even in 1958, they were not just seeing a small problem. They saw the problems that we are sitting with now. And now we begin to wonder if, are those 10 principles enough? Should we remove some or add some? Or should we create something totally different as the baby of the Freedom Charter? And maybe as young academics, we can begin to do the good work and start doing the celebration in parallel with creating new solutions with all the resources that are at our disposal. And part of those resources is voting right when we have to vote, because now we are in the second government of national unity, which we were not supposed to be in, but clearly we are losing it somewhere, and hopefully we can fix it.
Enkosi leadership, thank you so much. It's so amazing how the subject obviously inspires you. There's no speech or reading, nothing but the passion about this topic. We can just pulsating through the screen. Enkosi, thank you so much. All right, so we are at the keynote address. They call it in corporate. We're having our presentation by Oprah Manda Sloane. Guys, get your pens and papers out. School is in session. Thank you once again to the University of Limpopo for hosting us tonight. And also a reminder that the conference is next month and you guys can be a part of it. And I will leave all the details in the description box. Okay, cool. Thank you. Bramandla, good evening. Thank you so much. We're so excited.
Yeah, everyone. No, I just wanted to direct the people to come this side, because now like there's people on the Google Meet platform.
Hi, there's someone's mic who's on that needs to be off.
Oh, Sis Ntiki, this is me. I was saying that perhaps like we can address the people on Google Meet. I see that there's a lot of people on Google Meet, and I've shared the link to the, like to the YouTube platform. So, I mean, I was just suggesting that, everyone goes to the YouTube platform, everyone that is on Google Meet, because I see there's 20 people that are here, and I've been trying to project, and I've posted the link on the comment section, but colleagues are still here. So I really apologize for this. So please, like, just join via the link that I just shared in the comment section. Okay. Yeah, well, I think we can continue.
Thank you very much. So everybody on the Google link Meet, please can you come join us on the Moya channel on YouTube? It makes it much easier. Thank you so much. So we are ready. We are ready for school, Dade Mandla. Thank you so much for taking the time and the wisdom to share with us, the young people, so we can move things forward.
I would like to thank you for inviting me. I just didn't realize that it was going to be school. But I'm delighted to be here. Let me just say up front that I come to this conversation not being politically neutral, and I've never really been politically neutral. So I must be quite upfront about that. The request that was made to me was, I should I shouldn't try to discuss the whole document, but just to highlight a few things. As has been indicated, the Freedom Charter has 10 clauses, and I'm not going to discuss those clauses. I'm going to talk to a few things, and perhaps in the Q&A session, we can talk about the individual clauses. Now, the first issue I would like to address is an issue Dr. Totse has already referred to. We, the people of South Africa. But now, let me say, to start with, that on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Charter, Ben and I published a book which we titled Reflections on the Freedom Charter. And what motivated us was precisely the fact that for many years, the Freedom Charter has been held up as a holy cow. And those who were around in the 1980s might recall how dangerous it was to criticize the Freedom Charter. And so when 1994 came, we thought it would open up the space in which we could evaluate the document. The clauses of the Freedom Charter in themselves are not very problematic. And in fact, I must say upfront that I agree with the contents of a number of those clauses. What I will be discussing are the problem areas. And fortunately, Fezeka has already made reference to the misgivings of people like Umangaliso Sobukwe about the Freedom Charter. Now, starting off with the preamble, the Freedom Charter, which says we, the people of South Africa, what it then conveys is that all the declarations that one finds in the Freedom Charter are made by the people of South Africa. Now, my academic background is philosophy, and I would like to problematize that notion. And in trying to problematize it, I want to indicate that the Congress of the People was attended by some 3,000 delegates. And those delegates came from the African National Congress, the South African Indian Congress, the Congress of the Democrats, and the South African Colored People's Organization. Now, if they had said, we, the delegates of these organizations assembled here today, adopt these demands and we mobilize support for them, that would have been a different matter altogether. I can't imagine, for instance, Uguti, a meeting, say, for argument's sake, here PAC could have met in 1955 and then claimed to be speaking on behalf of all South Africans. Now, if the claim is serious that the declarations contained in the Freedom Charter are made by all South Africans, I think it would actually have a lot of integrity if they said on behalf of, rather than by the people of South Africa. Now, we would want to know, for instance, Uguti, the membership of these organizations that I have mentioned, the ANC, the South African Indian Congress, the Congress of Democrats, and the South African Colored People's Organization, in membership yabo, relative to the total population figures of South Africa, what would it have looked like in 1955? Now, it seems to me very clear that it would not have been representative of the entire population. Now, the other problem is, if we are to accept that these comrades who met there at Kliptown in 1955 were speaking for the entire South Africa, we would have had to inquire into what mandate they had to speak for the whole country. And that question has never been addressed. But what has been suggested is that 50,000 volunteers did door-to-door visits in which they were collecting demands zabantu. Now, that's fine. Then the next question is, where are those demands? Why are they never played out to us so that Sisbone Uguti, okay, you collected demands and you assigned 50,000 people to collect these demands, ZPS demands, for instance, we would like to see them. What did the people say that you collected the demands from? And then we would like to know, how were these demands analyzed and by whom were they analyzed in order to arrive at the postulates, the Freedom Charter? Now, all those questions remained unanswered and they remain issues begging for responses. Now, I could get into a lot of other details about this, but I'm not going to do that. But if you go to the closing clause here, Freedom Charter, here's what it says. Let all the people who love their people and their country now say, as we say here, these freedoms we will fight for side by side throughout our lives until we have won our liberty. Now, if we are to suppose that South Africans were speaking at Kliptown, then the philosophical question is, why would they be inviting the people of South Africa to say, as we say at Kliptown? You know what I mean? If the people were already speaking, then they would have spoken. It would not be necessary to invite them to say, as we are saying here at Kliptown. Now, that is the problem that I have with that statement, Yoguti. The declarations contained in the Freedom Charter were made by the people of South Africa. Then the next issue I would like to canvass is that very contentious clause which says South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. Now, you will, of course, appreciate that in 1955, the term black was not quite current in the political circles of the time. The term black actually gains political currency in 1967 with the advent of the Black Consciousness Movement. And that's the reason why political organizations were fashioned along different ethnic groups. That's why you had the African National Congress. That's why you had the Colored People's Organization. That's why you had the South African Indian Congress, and that's why you had the Congress of Democrats. Each of these so-called racial groups were organized separately. Now, the curious question here is, when the Freedom Charter says South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, what has happened, for instance, to Indians? That's question number one. Now, the debate about what that clause in the Freedom Charter means has bedeviled the history of the ANC for a very long time. People who have been in exile that I have spoken to have said to me, for instance, the young recruits who left South Africa in the 1970s, they kept on asking, but what do you mean South Africa belongs to all who live in it? And what they are saying to me is, when the ANC was unable to explain that, their response would have been, it looks like you have PAC leanings, and that killed the debate. The way they silenced the debate was to accuse the young recruits of having PAC leanings. Now, here's something else that I find interesting. In 1985, Ben Mokoena, who is a co-author with me of the book that I have already referred to. He was an operative ANC, and he was invited to Houston, to a radio station, a talk-in radio station in Houston. Now, he says to me, the people who participated in the radio discussions were largely Black Americans. And they had a lot of sympathy for everything that he said, until he said South Africa belongs to all who live in it, Black and white. He says that statement resulted in immediate hostility towards him. And the Black people in America said to him, it is because of people like you, it is because of Black people like you that Black people were sold into slavery. Now, he then says he gets driven back to New York. And at New York, he meets Uneo Mnumzan, who was the chief ANC representative in New York. And he asks Uneo, Comrade Neo, I don't understand this. The audience suddenly became so hostile. But what did you say which resulted in them becoming hostile? And Ben tells them, no, they became hostile when I said South Africa belongs to all who live in it, Black and white. And then Ben says, Neo threw his hands in the air, and put them on his head and said, Comrade Ben, how can you be so naive? We don't say such things in America. Now, here's my point. If the Congress movement believed as a matter of principle that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, Black and white, then it should be able to say that anywhere in the world. There shouldn't be places where they say something different and avoid telling what they said in South Africa. So my question here is, where has the good faith gone to? In 1970, Usobukwe was interviewed by Gail Gerhardt. And Usobukwe asked this question: how could they try to avoid the issue of whose land was stolen and by whom? Because that is at the heart of this thing, Yoguti, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, Black and white. How could they avoid that question? It was a rhetorical question that he was asking. But here's my problem. And you see, the notion that South Africa might belong to all who live in it is, for me, conceptually very difficult for the following reasons. When Europeans first landed on our shores, it was around about 1490, in the year 1490. Now, what they claimed when they settled on our shores was that they found a lot of empty spaces. So they didn't steal anybody's land. The spaces were empty. And all they did was to occupy those empty spaces. Now, as it became more and more difficult to sustain the thesis of empty spaces, they developed an alternative thesis. And the thesis which they developed was called terra nullius. What does that mean? It means all land which is occupied by indigenous people everywhere where Europeans went. If it is occupied by indigenous people, it means it has no owner, and therefore Europeans were entitled to appropriate it. The doctrine was called the doctrine of terra nullius. So they shift from empty spaces to terra nullius. But even terra nullius became very difficult to sustain. In the United States of America in the 1860s, there was a case in the Supreme Court. The title of the case is Johnson versus McIntosh. Now, in that case, what the Supreme Court of America says is Europeans compensated natives adequately for their land by introducing them to European ways of life and by introducing them to Christianity. So you can see they are shifting all the time. They start with empty spaces, they go to terra nullius, they go to compensation by introducing us to their religion and to their ways of life. Now, what does this say to you? I don't know what it says to you, but I'll tell you what it says to me. What it says to me is that Europeans never believed in the notion that stolen land can be shared equally between the thieves and the owners of the land. Once they stole any piece of land, they made sure that the natives from whom they had stolen it have no access to that land. There's no notion of joint ownership of the land. So, for instance, in South Africa, once they settled in after all the wars of dispossession, one of the laws they passed was the 1913 Land Act, followed up by the 1936 Land Act, followed up by the 1954 Urban Areas Act, and I have omitted to mention the Bantu Administration Act of 1927. But all these pieces of legislation, what they say is that the land belongs to us white people. We don't own it in common with the native. So where the Congress movement came from with the notion that it is possible to have joint ownership of stolen land, I would still love to have a response to that. To crown it all, the whole notion of Bantustans in South Africa was premised on the understanding by white people which said the land of South Africa, that is the 87% of the land in South Africa, belongs to them and to them alone. So even the notion of Bantustans was not consistent with any notion that stolen land might belong equally to the people who stole it and the people from whom it was stolen. But here comes the rub. The Freedom Charter declares, quote, only a democratic state based on the will of all the people can secure to all their birthright. I will say that again. Only a democratic state based on the will of all the people can secure to all their birthright. Now let us understand one another very clearly here. The concept of birthright, sometimes referred to inheritance, conveys the idea of passing on possessions from one generation to another. That is what the concept of birthright conveys. So what the Freedom Charter says is that a democratic state, which is based on the will of all the people, will secure to all the people, including those who stole the land, their birthright. Now, you see, birthright conveys the idea that there are certain things that you are entitled to by the sheer fact of your birth. You are entitled to those things. Now, in 1955, in 1955, when the Freedom Charter says this, the natives have already been dispossessed of their land through all the wars of dispossession. They have already been thoroughly dispossessed of their land. Now, not only that, the Land Acts have institutionalized the dispossession. And the Land Acts come in 1913 and in 1936. So when the Congress of the People says a democratic government based on the will of the people will secure to everybody their birthright, it says it against the backdrop, number one, that the native has already been dispossessed, that the dispossession of the native has already been institutionalized by the laws in South Africa. Now, when the democratic state eventually arrives in 1994, this is the order of things in South Africa. The native is confined to 13% of the land. So the children of the conquerors will inherit in terms of this clause of the Freedom Charter, they will inherit the 87%. The children of the native are entitled to inherit the remaining 13%. And all of that in the name of democracy. All of that in the name of the people. If you have ever wondered why South African Black people remain landless 30 years into democracy, Ndiabulela.
Thank you, Elder. You surprised me when you say that you didn't realize you're coming to school. Kaloku, you're at that age where when you open your mouth,
Point taken.
Thank you, Elder. Thank you. Ndate Steve, your response. Hey, this is so interesting. Thank you so much. The youth is so excited. I see Bank of Ambazonia there is thanking us. So many people in the audience. There are over 400 people watching and thankful and engaging. So please don't think that you are speaking to a wall. Bra Steve, can we have your response? Oh, unmute that is Steve. Rico, unmute her.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Ntiki, I think, I have actually been involved in this discussion since yesterday. And like I said yesterday, I was actually on Power FM. And, we were in an audience with, people that a lot of the viewers would actually recognize. But I think it is fair for me to say that Advocate Nguga Itobe was at the center of the discussion. Now, I was also in the panel, and what I'm going to discuss today is what I would have said yesterday, if I was given a chance. I do know that there's a great deal of concern as to how representative the Freedom Charter was, how representative it was in terms of the population. But from a historical point of view, the Freedom Charter has had to be, the outcome of a cumulative experiences of mass struggles that went before it. And that was my issue. My issue here is that it would have made sense if the Freedom Charter was a reflection on what had happened before it was adopted in 1955. And the point I was making is that the masses that we are talking about were already engaged in particular forms of struggles, which struggles have actually suffered a particular kind of attack. And this is a conspiracy of silence. And this is what I want viewers to understand. That in actual fact, what was happening here, the Freedom Charter becomes a reaction, to an ongoing Black radical tradition that actually shaped those mass struggles that I'm talking about. And what mass struggles are those? They actually happened in that 20-year period between 19 and 1939. And the fact that they had stopped was because of the war. And part of what we have to do is to reflect on them and actually say, how could they have been, perpetuated after the war and after the Second World War, I mean. But a great deal of things happened, including the institution of the Nationalist Party as the governing party and the introduction of apartheid. And that actually shifted the focus of these mass movements into something else, into responding to something new on the land. And what something new was this? It was the Bantu Authorities Act of 1949 and the Bantu Territorial Act of 1951. These were the immediate land issue realities facing Black people at this time. But the tendency was for Black people to organize themselves, into a mass movement, such as was the case between 1919 and 1939. And for those of you who want to know specifically, what that movement was made up of, I talked about it yesterday. This is where we have to understand the importance of the Bullhook massacre, in this mass movement that I'm talking about. And therefore, the Amma Israeli would be actually the first instance of this mass movement. But after that, there were quite a number. I pointed out yesterday that there was a women's movement called Amma Onye. And those two were pursuing the same, kind of campaigns, campaigns of getting access to land in whichever way they could under the circumstances of the time. And the long and the short of it is that in 1924, 27 of members of the Amafela Ndaonye were put on trial and actually sentenced to jail. Of those 27 members, 24 were women and 3 were men. And that's how serious this movement was. The reason we don't know about it, again, I will say this is a black radical expression. The only way to deal with it is to discard it completely. Now, that makes for good propaganda, but it is bad record keeping. It is bad record keeping that we don't have a clear sense of what Bullhook was about. It is bad record keeping that I'm talking about Amafela Ndaonye. And quite clearly, 99% of people in the audience are hearing this for the first time. But the enduring movement of that period was the Wellingtonian movement, which endured until 1939. The Wellingtonian movement was engaged in land struggles for nearly 17 years. Now, in fact, there are laws that were passed to contain the Wellingtonian movement. One of these that the Mandla referred to, the 1927 Native Administration Act, was an act directed at the Wellingtonian movement. And it worked, but because what it did, it banished its leadership, outside of the Transkei. And the only way they could meet their followers was to go to Graaf Reinet. Now, that was how it impacted on the movement. But the long and the short of it is that it is those people who responded, to all the land measures that were being introduced during this period. 1936, you have the Native Land and Trust Act, and Tate Mandla has referred to that. We refer to it as the Herzog Bills. Now, that is in fact one piece of legislation that was very devastating in its impact. Among other measures it introduced was cattle culling. Now, cattle culling goes hand in hand with the reduction of land available to Black people, which in itself was particularly, undermining. This actually leads to something that is a very important phenomenon. For the first time, you begin to have family migrations, into the cities. It replaces single male migrations. Now, part of what you see here is that this is a pattern of migration that is permanent. And these people are leaving not to come back because the situation where they come from has become untenable. So that's the impact. Now, 1955 Freedom Charter does not in any way, reflect, all these kinds of concerns. Because if it did, it would say, rather than say, South Africa belongs to all those who live within the preamble, it would reflect, the political rhetoric and the slogans of this period that I'm talking about. And what were those slogans? Africa for the Africans, Izwe. That's what the Freedom Charter would have said. Then it would have reflected, the popular consciousness, about land. And we wouldn't even have to debate, the issue of the statistics and say, was it representative enough? The issue here is, did the Freedom Charter capture the mass struggles that went on before it was adopted? And the answer is no. Now, what was the Freedom Charter in actual fact? The Freedom Charter was actually weaponized. It was weaponized by the white left. And we have to be very specific about this. I think I'm actually getting sick and tired of, actually, being easy about it. The brutal reality here is that the white radical left penetrated the ANC's decision-making processes. I explained this yesterday about how, The Africanists in the ANC had conceived the Defiance Campaign as a mass insurrection, but it was the intervention, of the white radical left, that dumped down, that actually downgraded the Defiance Campaign into a passive resistance movement. But where you don't see this influence, the Defiance Campaign becomes what it was intended to be, a mass insurrection. And this actually happens in 1952 in Duncan Village in East London. Nearly 200 people are killed, because this was a mass insurrection. And the reason they were killed, I explained yesterday. They brutally murdered a white Catholic nun, Sister Aidan, who had been working with them for quite some time. Yet again, this is a very important historical event that has been discarded completely from historical accounts. Again, it makes for good propaganda, but bad record keeping. Now, this is 52 and pretty close to 55 and the adoption of the Freedom Charter. Then the Freedom Charter is adopted. But before I actually get to the second phase of the Freedom Charter, this is only the first phase. The second phase of the Freedom Charter I will come to. But those mass struggles of the 1920s and 1930s also contained another different set of campaigns. And this has to do with what? Education. These communities wanted to have complete control over their education, starting from establishing their own schools. And to do that, they required land. So this is why the land struggle would have been connected also to the education struggle. And besides, these were communities that were also centered around particular churches. So the church would actually be also a school. It would be a church on a weekend, and it would be schools during the week. The issue here is that you are talking about communities that were, independent thinking, self-reliant, the kinds of communities, that were prepared to take land, issues of land, and actually engage in serious struggles with the colonial state. Now, all of these things should have been reflected in the Freedom Charter. The clause that says the doors of learning shall be open. These communities did not need anybody to open the door of learning and culture. They would establish their own institutions and open those doors themselves, not rely on a white person to do so. And that's the issue about why the Freedom Charter was actually completely disconnected to the real experiences of the people. Now, finally, the Freedom Charter happens in the same year as Sophiatown is actually undergoing complete destruction. And the people are being removed precisely because they are in a white spot. Now, quite honestly, you don't come up and say South Africa belongs to all those who live in it, when in actual fact, Sophiatown is supposed to be a white suburb called Triumph. And that is what actually makes sense. Now, this is why I think in the context of the mass movement of that period, the Freedom Charter was drafted by people who were not connected to the masses. The idea that the ANC was a mass movement in the 1950s is actually being put forward merely to sustain all of these kinds of distortions of our history. In reality, the ANC would have remained connected, not even rooted to the masses, while they still had Africanists in their midst. And when Africanists walked away to form the PAC, the ANC was deprived of all its mass support. Think about it. What does the ANC do between 1958 and 1960? Is there any mass action? There isn't. And this explains why, to show that it is the Africanists who were in fact connected to the masses. It is the Africanists who organized the Anti-Pass March of 1960 that leads to the Sharpeville massacre. What does the ANC say about this? Can it actually claim to the masses during this period? It cannot. And what it says instead is that, hey, by the way, we had actually conceived of the march that led to the Sharpeville massacre. It is these opportunists in the PAC, who staged this march 10 days prematurely. We planned it for the 31st of March. They overtook us and did it, on the 21st. The reality here is that go read going to the bar, organizing meetings, with people in the area. And that is how that march became so mass supported. Now, we are here talking about who was connected to the masses. Yes, in the 1950s, the ANC may have been a mass movement, but this was only true. It had the Africanists. Without the Africanists, it was no longer a mass movement. What can we conclude? The Freedom Charter
We seem to have lost Steve on this side. Steve, your network, Yari Paul Kawitz. Maybe whoever's doing technicals for Steve, if you log off and log on again, because we seem to have lost your network. So, Mandla, while we try sort out this thing, no, Steve, Kuko umbuzo apa, uti, what do we need to do now? Do we keep the Freedom Charter? Do we upgrade it into a new social contract? What do we do now?
Okay. I will respond the way Frantz Fanon would have responded. And here's what Frantz Fanon would have said. Every generation must discover its own mission, fulfill it, or betray it. This is your generation. It is really entirely up to you, Uguti. What do you do? You must find your mission. Now, okay, I didn't say the whole thing, but Frantz Fanon says, in conditions of relative obscurity, AM generation is to mitigate those conditions of obscurity so that you don't search for your mission in conditions of total obscurity. And what Comrade Steve and I, for instance, have been doing here is sharing insights coming from the generations as Velaguzo, so that you know exactly what we have been through, what the plans were. Now, some years back, there was an attempt, okay, there's a lot of talk just now about a national dialogue. But 15 years ago, there was an attempt to have a national dialogue. And I had actually been requested to draw up a paper on the basis of which that national dialogue would be held. And what I did in the paper was to take all the struggle documents which were produced by various components of the liberation movement and say, these are the roadmaps that we had plotted for ourselves. Now, my analysis at the time was that there was only one of the things pointed out in those roadmaps, which we can say without any fear of contradiction, Uguti, we have achieved it, and it's the right to vote. All other things that we said in those struggle documents, we have failed. Now, my suggestion to younger people of today is go and look at those documents and see whether they make sense to you. Some of them are fairly good. Others are presented as minimum documents. The Freedom Charter, for instance, was always conceived of as a minimum demands platform. And this tied up neatly with the, they've been speaking about the two-stage theory of struggle. You will first have the national democratic revolution, and thereafter you can struggle for economic rearrangement of things. And many of us were opposing that. Many of us were almost necklaced on the 18th of January, 1986. I escaped being necklaced by the skin of my teeth because I was questioning that approach to the liberation struggle. So yes, my advice is look at those documents and see whether they make sense to you in the conditions eniphila kuzo namhlanje, and find your mission, betray it or fulfill it.
Thank you, sir. Nangu Steve sebuyile, so we can go back to you, Steve. Enkosi.
I don't know at what point you lost me. Hi, Nziki.
Hi, I'm trying to think also because now I've
Okay.
had new information.
But I do think that, the point that I was making was almost complete, because I was at a point at which I was explaining that, given the political context and particularly the experiences of struggle, that led to the adoption of the Freedom Charter, that, quite clearly, evidently.
But the audience is saying that you were in Sharpeville in the 1960s.
Yes.
That's what the audience is saying.
Yes, in fact, I was at that point where I was saying that the ANC actually, the connection here is that it is the PAC that was a mass movement, and therefore it is the PAC that organized the anti-pass march that precipitated the Sharpeville massacre. Now, the point I'm making here is that is evidence enough that the ANC was not quite connected to the masses, and that the 1950s as a whole, if you look at the 1950s in totality, the ANC would have been a mass movement only on account of the Africanists being inside it. This, Ntiki, is what we are all about. I mean, even Black Wednesday, it is all about this. It is all about trying to explain the most important phenomenon in South Africa's liberation struggle history. What really happened to the Black radical tradition? And the point I'm making about the Freedom Charter is that it was weaponized against an Africanist stroke Black radical tradition. That is what the Freedom Charter is all about. And I was saying, the discourses have been going on about the fact that the Freedom Charter was not actually written by white people. But today, Thabang was able to unearth a book, by Rusty Bernstein, where he actually, asserts, and this is in his memoirs, and he asserts that he was responsible for drafting a number of the clauses in the Freedom Charter. That's the first thing. And Rusty Bernstein is known to have actually done that. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there are economic categories in the Freedom Charter. And the economic categories are the brainchild of Ben Turok. Now, Ben Turok used to be the CEO of Institute for African Alternatives. And at some point during our discussions, Ben Turok and his late today did actually admit that he conceptualized, the economic categories that are contained in the Freedom Charter. That's the second thing. This is a historical reality. It is not a figment of my imagination. The third issue here is that the Freedom Charter has a clause that says land will be shared equally among those who work it. Now, this is 1955. And if we think about the categories of Black people and their relationship to land, Black people are not working the land in 1955, if Black people are in the Orange Free State in the commercial farms in 1955, it is not them working the land. It is the boer and the tractor. Now, how do Black people then come to share in that kind of an equation? They are not part of that equation at all. In actual fact, by 1955, Black people on white commercial farms are descending into a state of serfdom. Now, what happens to the Freedom Charter between 60 and 75? It goes into, it goes into exile with the ANC, and it is completely absent in the political landscape inside South Africa. In fact, to say until 1975 is a bit of a distortion, but you don't have any discussion about the Freedom Charter at any time between 1960 and 1978. This is precisely because the dominant political paradigm and tradition that is at work here is the Black consciousness, Black radical mass movement. And the Freedom Charter does not, enter the political equation at this stage. But at what point does it do? Yet again, for the second time, the Freedom Charter is, once again taken out of history and weaponized yet again against a Black radical tradition. And what is that Black radical tradition? It is obviously the Black consciousness philosophy and the Black consciousness movement that emerges after Black Wednesday. And that is where AZAPO comes into the equation. AZAPO finds itself as a continuation of the Black radical movement of the 1970s. But what it comes up against is actually the Freedom Charter. And the Freedom Charter effectively and successfully, undermines AZAPO and the Black consciousness movement as the mass movement of the time. And it is therefore replaced by the mass democratic movement. But here is an issue that we need to deal with. The mass democratic movement had as its think tank the white radical left. And Wits University of Cape Town would have produced academics, who were actually, in actual fact, actively involved in thinking through, the liberation struggle narrative and actually imposing it on, on Black societies. And again, let's go back to what the sites of struggles would have been. High schools were again the target here. COSAS became the target as a vehicle of explaining the Freedom Charter in the 1980s. But what did the Freedom Charter actually represent in the 1980s? It actually represented the necklace. Let's be frank about it. The political, character of the Freedom Charter and the movement associated with it is the movement of the necklace. And all of that is, in fact, an attack, a systematic attack on what? On the Black radical tradition. So I always say that the mass movement of the 1970s and the Black radical tradition of the time may have been subjected to a systematic assault by the apartheid state. No doubt that actually happened. But complementing the apartheid state on this, was the Freedom Charter. These were charterists, who insisted in the 1980s that it is only them, who have the privilege, to carry on the struggle. And what you had in the 1980s was actually a Black on Black violence. If you take out the IFP out of this equation, what you remain with is the charterists across South Africa actually attacking the Black radicals of the Black consciousness movement. That is what, some people would remember the Freedom Charter for. And finally, what you are going to be hearing a lot of is that, the Freedom Charter is reflected in the 1996 Constitution. And yes, what it may well be. And, the fact that it is actually incorporated into the 1996 Constitution explains why the masses are excluded from anything, that is going on today. It is not something new. It is in the nature of the Freedom Charter and the ways in which it was incorporated into the Constitution that it is going to exclude the masses, and it continues to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would like to hand over to the question and answer session. If there's any questions in the audience, this is the correct time to ask questions to our panel. Let me just check if there is one that we can jump into now. Gutwa, can the question of land also be politicized? Because it's another way that politicians use to get people worked up. Maybe look at how do we redesign. I don't know if any...
Can Ramanda take on that? Hello?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to unmute myself.
Oh.
The question is, can the land question be depoliticized? I don't know why it would be necessary to depoliticize it. It is a political issue. The fact of the matter is there were wars which were fought, and those wars resulted in conquest, in which conquest the natives were relieved of their land. I would like to understand why anybody would like to depoliticize the land question, because it sits at the heart of our political problems in South Africa. I don't think, I suppose it can be depoliticized, but my argument is that it should not be depoliticized, because what would you be doing in depoliticizing it? The fact of the matter is, political arrangements were made in order to ensure that the land issue in South Africa remains what it is today. And there can only really be a political solution to that problem. And by the way, let's talk about this. You see, before the negotiations started, the National Party in September 1989 produced what they called the National Party's plan of action for the future. And in that document, one of the things they say is that they are going to negotiate a political settlement of such a nature that it doesn't matter who is sitting in Benes, they can't change anything. The constitution must be cast in stone in such a manner that it doesn't matter who is sitting in Benes, they can't change anything. Now, this is what the National Party says on the one hand, and it is one of the main protagonists in these negotiations. The other protagonist is the ANC. One of the resolutions which it adopts at the CDF, Conference for a Democratic Future, is that we are going to negotiate, we are going to use the Harare Declaration as our negotiating platform. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with the Harare Declaration, but one of the things the Harare Declaration says is that it is based on the Lusaka Manifesto. So basically, if the ANC says it's going to use the Harare Declaration as a negotiating platform, in effect, what it says is that the Lusaka Manifesto is the basis of their negotiations. Now, what did the Lusaka Manifesto say? The Lusaka Manifesto said there was no liberation struggle in South Africa. There was a struggle for civil and political rights. Now, if we had only a civil rights struggle in South Africa, then surely you can understand why the land question did not feature at Kempton Park. Because it was not a national liberation struggle. It was a struggle for democratic rights, and that's what CODESA delivered. And I don't think you can solve that problem outside of the political arena. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but and my thoughts are that the reason why in 1960, the ANC undertook, there was a shift from mass struggles of the 1950s to armed struggle, which was supposed to have started in 1961 going forward. And the reason that was done was the realization that you can never have, any kind of land arrangement, which is going to change the outcomes of conquest without embarking on an armed struggle. So the issue here is that land was not, people refer to the 1913 Land Act, and the impression created is that the 1913 Land Act was an instrument of land dispossession. Now, that is completely wrong. The instrument of land dispossession was conquest. Now, what the 1913 Land Act did was something completely different. In actual fact, if you look at the provisions of the 1913 Land Act, the target here was actually independent African producers. That is what the Land Act was actually attacking. And unfortunately, this is a situation that you cannot, achieve through social engineering. You cannot have a piece of legislation changing circumstances on a commercial farm within a day. But this is the mistake people do. And this actually includes some very, celebrated legal experts. And people want to suggest that the Land Act of 1913 was enacted on the 19th of June. And the suggestion is that by the 20th of June, Black people on the land had actually been reduced to wage laborers. Now, that's rubbish. That actually never happened. This is why I'm saying the Land Act of 1913 was not an instrument of land dispossession. It was doing other things. What is important to understand also is that the Constitution of 1996 is not going to be an instrument of land restoration. Land can only be restored to its rightful owners. And the ANC understood this in 1960 through armed conflict, through armed struggle. Zimbabwe was an example of how that was supposed to have been done. That's the only way the land issue could have been settled. I'm answering your question, can we depoliticize the land question? The answer is that the land question, and Ramandla has actually explained, it is so fortified. It is white privilege fortified that the only way that we can deal with it is the ways in which the ANC understood in 1960. You can never negotiate land restoration. It has never happened anywhere in history. Land restoration and land dispossession are two things that happen, out of violence. You cannot depoliticize the issue.
You know what the danger is, ne? The danger is that Abelungu have created this section called the middle class. And when you are questioned inside of that, it just becomes it's too much effort, It's like, do we really need to? Because we're not all right. But the truth is that the majority are right. So us now are right if all of us are not right. But siyayazi ke lena. Okay, kukho nansi enye umbuzo uthi uBhutmandla uthi apha, given this historical account, is there a possibility that this touted national dialogue is aimed at serving as a modern day freedom charter?
Oh. Yeah. Okay. First, let me just comment on the comment that you made, if you don't mind, Tsiki. I was raised in the Methodist Church with all the propaganda we are exposed to. You can't tell lies, here the court, there the lang. So when I got involved in the struggle, one of the difficulties I faced was, if the special branch asks me, uphi uThami Mazwai at this point in time, and I know ukuthi uphi uThami Mazwai, do I tell them ukuthi uphi in order to be comfortable with my religious upbringing? Now, that troubled me for a very long time, until I came across a statement by Lenin where he said, there is no truth in common between an oppressor and the oppressed. There is no truth in common between an oppressor and the oppressed. So to the extent that a middle class is occupying a certain position, and that position is antithetical to the things which need to get done in order to correct the political problems of South Africa, we have to make peace with the fact that there is no truth in common between us and them. And we have to forge ahead and do what we know is necessary in order to correct izinto naikai. Now, the question, national dialogue, it's not a new thing. You may have picked up from a statement which was made by Ramaphosa, ukuthi this national dialogue is going to be preceded by a number of national conventions. So there will be national conventions, and then those national conventions will feed into the national dialogue. Now, the national convention issue is also not a new thing. It was always at the core of Congress politics. And we mounted such a campaign against the idea, a national convention, that Utatu Kgolihlahla, before he was released from the island, he proclaimed from Robben Island that a national convention is not on the agenda of the liberation movement. Fatima Mir immediately jumped up and said, this is not the Nelson Mandela I know. The Nelson Mandela I know is committed to a national convention. Utatu Kgolihlahla very quickly backtracked and said, I was misquoted. Now, but if you do a trajectory, you can see ukuthi it's not a new thing. There is a real possibility that the National Convention might be the modern day form, Congress of the People. It might indeed be the modern day or the latter day version, Congress of the People, just by reading the announcement that Ramaphosa has made, but also by looking at the people that he has appointed as, because he spoke about eminent persons group. If you look at the people who make up that group, you can see ukuthi iyaphi yonke lento. And so yes, I'm inclined to agree ukuthi there is a real danger that it might be a latter day version of the Congress of the People.
Ntate Steve, o batla ho kena mo?
Is it your question? I'm actually listening and I'm wondering whether we are here talking about the black middle class. Is that what we are talking about?
Yes, we were saying. Yes, we were saying, Guti, that is seems to be the challenge, the obstacle to total freedom is the black middle class.
Yes, but then we still have to periodize that. Well, and it is important to actually periodize it, one. And secondly, we are not talking about a uniform, black middle class. If you think about it, I mean, if we periodize it, just in terms of distinct historical moments, the interesting period would be 1960 to 1975, and probably cut across different geographic locations. What was the middle class? Was there a middle class, say, in the self-governing territories between 1960 and 75? And was there a middle class in the black townships? Because I suspect that the answer to that question would reveal that, there are important differences between, the two social groups. If you think about the black townships of 1960 to 75, they were characterized by a uniformity. And this does not mean that there was no class that was a cut above the rest. There was. There was Dr. Motana in Soweto. There was Date Maponya in Soweto. There was Shabalala in Soweto. And it is easier to conclude that on the basis of this small segment of black society in a particular location, you do have a middle class. But it is almost difficult, to actually make an argument for the existence of that class. And a perfect example is an attempt to break down the Sophiatown community, into tenants and landlords or property owners, and then conclude that property owners are actually a middle class. That was actually, the kind of knee-jerk reaction just in explaining those communities. But it is also a historical fact that the middle class, in most instances, actually live cheek by jowl with the underclass. So there may be indicators, of class difference. The issue is that there are indicators of class difference, and therefore the class, positions exist. The issue is, are they consequential? Do they have any consequences at all? Then I'm coming to the 1980s. The 1980s saw a deliberate creation, a sustained deliberate creation of a black middle class. And again, we go back to our series and see, WHAM, Win Hearts and Minds. At the center of WHAM was the creation of a black middle class. Now, once you do that, you are actually extricating that small segment of what we refer to as the middle class in the earlier period. You are giving them a kind of a geography of class, and that becomes quite distinct. And people seem not to understand, the impact of that in the context of South Africa and in the context of total strategy. Think about the collapse of schools in Soweto, in Katlehong, in the black townships. At any time between 1984 to 1993, there was a total collapse of black schools in the black townships. But children of middle classes, lived on the edge of the townships. Deep Kloof Extension is on the edge of Soweto. It was easier for children coming out of Deep Kloof Extension to access the highway and go to school for 5 years uninterrupted. Now that becomes a very distinct advantage that the black middle class, would have had. And that is the situation today. Now, the most important thing is that, again, flowing from WHAM and total strategy, there was an understanding that there had to be a material basis put in place so that we can be able to reproduce this class over an extended period of time. And that material base became what? It became good education for their children. It became good jobs that they were actually into. If they were not, policemen who were at Protea police station and living in Protea out there, which was also, a deliberately created middle class environment. The issue here is that, that middle class was created specifically for political purposes, for purposes of enlarging the lager. You know what the lager is? When the Boers actually form a defensive kind of setup with their wagons. Now they invited a few people inside the lager so that those people would be the first victims of the next mass movement. That happened in 1984. And true to form, those people actually became the victims of that mass movement. If you think about it, a lot of policemen who were living
Bra
in
Steve, Bra Steve,
for-
can I cut
yeah,
you there? You
yeah.
you are inside Black Wednesdays right now. I'd like you
Yeah,
to bring
sorry,
us
yeah.
back to the
Yeah,
Freedom
no, okay.
Charter,
Okay,
why
okay,
we are
okay.
here. You know,
Pardon?
in fact, Usis Fezega has been quite you know, can we give her an opportunity? Abut Mujal, if I can talk that to you afterwards
Oh,
with your
okay.
question. But Sis Fezega, early contribution.
I think already now I'm picking up the generational differences. I think we clearly have a lot to do on our part. We have little that we know. But to answer the first question, Wuti, what do we do? Or where do we start? The problem is now, it's very straightforward. We haven't accepted the reality that what we are living under is unbearable. We are suffocating under it. And when we accept just that basic statement, Yoguti, South Africa is not South Africa for all of us, then we begin the internal work that must happen. Because when we start the internal work, the question becomes, are you really going to buy a Mercedes-Benz with your salary that you are struggling with? And I'm targeting Mercedes because I'm reminded of how the Jewish people had rejected Volkswagen because it was created by people who oppressed them. Black people have, in fact, even I think I'm guilty of this. We have been conditioned to forgive to a point where we deceive ourselves. We live in a lie, and that's the truth, and it doesn't matter who says it tomorrow. We live in a lie. The documents are a reflection of the depth of the lie and how the lie has been embedded in our society. Now, when I lecture, because I'm a history lecturer for education, my students would always say, you are problematic, you want us to stress, you don't want us to enjoy. And I will tell them, Uguti, the day you tell the truth to yourself, it's easier to challenge these things. Because even the people who, even Black young men, I'm sorry if they are here, but even Black people who talk about decolonization, they haven't begun to picture it because it's not the picture they want. And getting the picture we are used to accepting is the glamorized picture. And that thing, Yoguti, as a generation, we are faced with something that means we must sacrifice ourselves so that the other come. And unfortunately, self-sacrifice is much difficult than a generation that is being sacrificed by the other race. Immediately, Usindiso Magaga was trying, and I'm wondering why were no people following on his step and he was alone and killed alone. And you must understand, once you choose this route, if you choose and you want to be sincere, you must accept Indogbana. The fight you are starting, it's potentially similar to what Mandela had said, which you must be willing to die for it, because literally, they will shoot you 7 bullets before you feed your kids. And it will happen, and we'll talk about you, and we'll move on. And this had happened in Fismas Fall, and things always, as Dr. Steve was saying, things become weapons, like slowly, because the thinking, we never spend enough time thinking. And whoever asked that question, who said, what must we do? I feel your anxiety, because it seems as if we're at the dead part of the road, as though there's no way to turn. Who do you trust? Because even you can't trust me, because when the eating comes, I leave you there and I go and eat. Some problems are not as complicated as we make them out to be. And my concern now is Black universities or historically Black institutions are white elephants in their own communities. We drive past the people we serve as though we are not recognizing the role we're supposed to play in those communities. People chase conferences internationally before they even host a conference in their own institution. People will chase being a professor before they are fulfilled to have content to give. And you wonder why you are sitting with a professor and the professor is hollow. And the issue now, we can't tell the professor that, no, professor, you are not the caliber we were hoping to learn from, because even you, the students you are bringing up, you are limiting them. There's something we call limiting care, which Black academics do on Black students, where we want them to pass, assuming they will figure themselves out. But when they come back, they don't have content. Now, you can't expect me to think for everyone. We must be building thinkers. And unfortunately for us, clearly, it's groundwork. Because now if I teach history And I've been Udok, I wish he was here. He would say this. Why was I insert Sobukwe in so many things that I do, because he's the one person I feel we need to celebrate authentically. We need to remind ourselves why he was even standing up in that time. Because for as long as we ignore the silence, the omitted histories, it's clear today that we don't know enough of what we think we know. It was only when I traveled to Tanzania where I realized, oh, there's actually a place called Morogoro, and there's actually a college that can run without, and the way we complicate education in South Africa as though we are a hoo-ha of education, when next door in Zimbabwe, there's excellence, and now we are having problems with academics who are Zimbabwean or foreigners who are better than most academics we have here. So if liberal institutions, Stellenbosch today, UCT today, if they are grooming their thinkers, what are we doing besides chasing accolades? And I think that's why this conference is becoming poignant, because it makes you move away from yourself and realize the problem. You will never have 17 houses for as long as we have this system. And you can build your upstairs all you like. They will never have the value of the land that these white people are sitting at. And before I leave, because I did a psychology, we are always tiptoeing around the fact that the psyche of a white person is problematic. And we should not confuse that with us being a problem. We are not a problem in the mind. Black people are not born a problem. White people are neurotics. Because even from them relating with the other people, they have this thing called Orientalism, where for them to feel better, they must make sure you are less than what they are. Then that's how they feel like they are themselves. And if you go to America, I know America is glorified. If you go to America and you walk in the streets, you look at yourself and say, I am better than these white people who are here. Whether it's health or it's looks, but I want us to go back to the self. Ngoba now we have lost what Steve Biko had told us. We will always be alone. Whether we try to be like the other, we are still alone. And if you want to start somewhere, start with yourself. The things that you do that diminish the value of a Black person, remove them from your own practice. Then everything else that is big, because we don't wake up every day to say we're going to do history, we're going to make history. It happens as you are doing what history needs you to do. So I think that's my part. But as a generation, I feel like Siglele, there's a part of us that is in deep sleep, and we're all chasing the wrong things, and it's gonna catch us. It's gonna catch us soon.
Abut Mujalefa Kopaorefe, the last question, and then our panelists can give closing remarks. We have been here for much longer than we expected, and we're going to have closing remarks after this last section. So Abut Mujalefa.
Yes, my question is basically directed to Steve. He spoke about the idea of weaponizing the Freedom Charter and the distinction between the ANC and the PAC, to say that the charter was more like a weapon that was used to deal with the radical, to deal with the Black radicals. So I wanted to understand, like, from, if hypothetically speaking, the PAC was able to draft the charter. In your own opinion, Steve, what would it look like? How would it be different from the charter that we have today? Looking at what the PAC stood for and the distinction that there was between the ANC and the Freedom Charter. I mean, the ANC and the PAC regarding the charter itself. So I'm just interested in looking at that specifically, because if the charter, as you say, was weaponized, it means that the PAC was agitating for a particular point of view that was a bit different from what was ultimately adopted. So what would be your views around that? Thank you.
Yes, that I'm not going to take too long in responding to that, but I think it is a very relevant question. And incidentally, this is a question that Mbuyiseni Ngozi actually posed on me yesterday, and unfortunately, it happened just before the news break, and I was about to answer the very same question. Then he went into news break, but when he came back, he ignored me completely. So that gives me an opportunity to answer this question. And he said to me, if the way he framed it was, if the Freedom Charter had reflected the mass struggles of the period that I talked about, what would it have said? What would it look like? Which is almost the same as you are saying, but you are referring to the PAC. Now, here is an issue. I'm going to repeat this statement. I've made it several times, but it is important again here, to make this statement again. The Black radical tradition, the very circumstances of its emergence, demand or require that it be misinterpreted. Now, the fact that we have to deal with this and struggle with it is because we haven't been given the opportunity to understand that the PAC had an ideology that did not in 1959 when it was established. The PAC was a custodian of an earlier Black radical, tradition. And that's the Black radical tradition that I spoke about of the 1920s and 1930s. And if we were to characterize that Black radical tradition, we often say, at the risk of a misinterpretation, we often say it is Garveyite. It is inspired by the ideas of Marcus Garvey. But we have reason for saying so, and we can substantiate that. The movement that we are talking about, all those mass movements that I referred to, the Wellingtonian movement, the Ama Israeli, Ama Felandaonye, all of them saw themselves as South African chapters of the Garveyite movement. And it was not only in South Africa, you had, same movements in Malawi, along the East Coast, in Zambia. And they were there, they were the mass movements of that period, on the African continent. So what is it? What's the slogan that emerges out of this, that the PAC becomes a custodian of in the 1950s? It is the idea that came with Marcus Garvey that said, Africa for the Africans. And that becomes, what the PAC would actually insist upon. So between 20 and 39, that is the clarion call. The clarion call is that Africa is for the Africans. Now, this is completely contradictory to South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. I hope you can see the distinction here. But the PAC did not come up with this only in 1958. This has been a slogan, a paradigm of the mass mobilization of African people, for the better part of the first half of the 20th century. That is what characterized Black mass movement, against the colonial state. So you ask me, what would the PAC say in the 1960s? It said Africa is for the Africans. So what does actually the Freedom Charter do? The Freedom Charter naturalizes Europeans. It actually indigenizes Europeans. But it is unlikely that it is African people who could have done this. It is white people indigenizing themselves. And the Freedom Charter is a product of that. And Tsiki, we talked about, and this was in the context of post-Black Wednesday, but we talked about the phenomenon of Black being absent even when they are present, and white being present even when they are absent. The drafting of the Freedom Charter is precisely that. Black people were absent even though they were present, and white people were present even though they were absent. That's the phenomenon. But let me point this out quite clearly. Historically, and we can prove this phenomenon rears its head in political organizations that have found philosophical and intellectual justification for incorporating non-Africans into the movement. That is, in fact, the problem. The problem is precisely that. Okay, I hope I've answered the question.
Yes, you have answered the question. Before I get the closing remarks from Dr. Stewart, Dicela Tatumandla, just to give your closing remarks.
Oh, Tsiki. My closing remarks are one that I appreciate highly the discussions that we have been having here. I was going to comment earlier on the class issue which you had raised, to which we responded differently. No, Comrade Steve. I happen to agree with both of you. I think that the importance of the intervention, Yaga Steve, is Uguti. You see, if we are going to talk class politics, then we've got to go back to Marx and company. And then we have to say, Uguti, the origins of the term class, what were people having in mind? And one of the things we would have to work through is that in order to be a class, well, there's a class in itself and a class for itself, which means a class must be able to reproduce itself. Now, central to the issues that Steve was debating was the question, Yoguti, can the black middle class reproduce itself? Because many people that we typically say belong to the black middle class will tell you they are a salary away from becoming members of the working class again. And therefore, they are not a class for themselves. And we have to be sensitive to those things. But I thought the issue you were raising, Wena, was an issue of consciousness. Because you might have black people who do not fully qualify to be members of the middle class, but whose consciousness is embedded in that class, and they believe it is actually in their interests to maintain izinto exactly as they are, which is why I responded to you ngalendlela in the end. I responded when they do that, if they align themselves with problematic political positions, then of course we have to draw a firm line on the sand. In order for us to be able to move forward, we have to override them. But the whole thing about the Freedom Charter, I think it's something that we need to debate endlessly. And I have liked the questions which were raised, especially Uguti, what do we do now? Because it's one thing to have these conversations and criticize this and criticize that. But the real challenge is, how do we change the world? And I think the youth of today has a momentous task in defining their position relative to that question. What is their contribution going to be in trying to change South Africa and making it into what Ufezeka is saying should be a livable South Africa for everybody? Some of us are 1 foot in the grave already, and and that struggle is going to remain with you guys. But for as long as we have the other foot outside of the grave, please don't hesitate to rope us in. But it's your struggle now. And course.
Thank you so much. I think we are wrapping up now because it is late. Unfortunately, there were lots of people who wanted to come on and join, but ingatigu late. Dr. Stewart Kugara is going to do our closing remarks. It's been such a privilege and an honor to be here. And thank you to the over 700 people who are watching online. We appreciate your presence. Dr. Kukara, good evening, and we are ready for the closing remarks.
Thank you so much, distinguished guests, panelists, and colleagues, students, and those who joined us virtually. Good evening. I come before you this evening with great humility and gratitude on behalf of Dr. Murubula Ngwenya, who is the head of Department for Cultural and Political Studies at the University of Limpopo, who has also kindly asked me to deliver this vote of thanks on her behalf. First and foremost, allow me to extend our sincere appreciation to the Departments of Cultural and Political Studies and Social Science and Economic Management for their collaborative vision in co-hosting this important dialogue, made even more impactful through the partnership with Moya Podcast. The theme and the spirit of today's engagement speaks powerfully to the continuing relevance and contestation, especially of the Freedom Charter as a living document. We are deeply honored by the presence and the contributions of our panelists, Dr. Chose, who left, Mamiya, our beloved sister Nseki, Fezeka, Mandla, Brastiv. Thank you for your compelling insights, your critical reflections, your courage to interrogate the Freedom Charter with both historical fidelity, contemporary agents, and unadulterated truth. Your analysis juxtaposing it to the Charter's ideals with the lived lives of our South Africans today have actually enriched our understanding and sparked necessary introspection on issues of equality, governance, land, and also people's power. To those who joined us virtually, thank you so much. Your presence and your participation through the comment section showed that critical dialogue transcends the boundaries of space. Your engagement affirmed the conversation of freedom, justice, transformation is still alive and is also evolving. As we conclude, let us carry forward the energy of this dialogue, not as a moment, but as a part of an ongoing commitment to interrogate and to reimagine the meanings of our freedom in our time. We hope this conversation will echo in our classrooms, in our communities, in the taxis, at the market, in the police spaces. On behalf of Dr. Murubula Ngwenya and the organizing teams, I thank you all warmly for your presence and your contributions. Let us continue to think, to speak, and to act with courage. It was indeed food for thought and none for the stomach. Thank you so much. Enjoy.
Thank you.
By the way, Sigi,
Yes,
I meant to alert you that yesterday the Kenyan media is calling it Black Wednesday. I don't know if you saw that. There's
really?
There's Black Wednesday in Kenya.
Oh my goodness.
There was a protest and 16 people were killed, by the police. And the Kenyan media dubbed it Black Wednesday.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
Interesting times. Oh, and then I'd like to send acknowledgements from Date Charles Ndabeni, who was watching and wanted to join online, and he just wanted to say thank you, especially to the matriarch Fezeka. So yes, lots of people were watching, lots of people were thankful. It's been such a privilege. So we'll see each other at the conference on the 16th and 17th. Is that correct?
Yes.
And how do people get more information about it, like the times, or do people have to pay or anything like that?
There are calls. The call has all of the details in terms of who to email for inquiries. And also those who can pay will pay. And the call will have all of that information.
Where is the call? Where would someone go look for this information? On the
do we have
website?
We should have it on everyone's email who's inside TURF, but also I can give you the email of someone they can contact, like Mr. Mjalifa is here. that person you can email for any questions that you have. Even you can ask me, and then we can just share. If you just want the call, I can email it.
Alternatively,
yes.
Yes, I think even also if they can go on the university,
Website.
I think website, and then if they can just search Freedom Charter Conference, there should be a specific website for the actual conference with all the details, as Sisters are saying.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we hope that that goes well. Everybody, the 16th and 17th, University of Limpopo is having the Freedom Charter Conference as we continue this dialogue to see what is written in black and white that is holding us down and how can we start to erase some of this. Thank you so much to our speakers, Ndatu Mandla, Nodatu Steve, Siabulela Elders, Sibulela Ufezeka, Sibulela Mjalifa, Ngosi, Dr. Stewart, no Dr. Tonzi earlier on. Thank you so much to the University of Limpopo for trusting the Moya podcast to run this program. We'll see you again next time. Thank you.